This is how the Amazon package arrived. It came packaged in a little box, all wrapped into a zip bag, and included the main board that came with some SMD components already soldered to the board, the probe clips, and a second Ziploc bag that had all the rest of the small components inside. It also came with the user's manual. And of course the LCD board that I haven't mentioned yet. I first started by sorting through all the small components and making sure everything I needed was there. And I quickly realized that it didn't come with the power cord. Every component was then tested for its functionality before I started to solder anything to the board. Most of the components that came out of the bag were the resistors, so it was best to get those out of the way first. Resistors don't have any poles like the electronic capacitors, LEDs, and other components in this kit, and so it didn't matter in which direction I soldered them in place. I just had to make sure to cut the unused leads flush after soldering. I will leave you guys some links in the description where you can find everything you might need to complete such a build. After all the resistors were soldered to the board, I then made sure to test all the connections, using my multimeter and pressing the probes to both leads of the components, making sure none of them got fried during the process. With all the resistors now in place, this is what the board looked like. The next step was to install the diodes. There was only 2 of these that came with the kit, and I had to make sure they were installed the right way. The negative side of a diode is called a cathode, and it is marked with a gray ring on one side. Luckily, the main board had clear markings in which direction to point the cathode. The next component on the list was a 8 MHz crystal oscillator, which was followed by the USB plug-in. And the board started to look somewhat better already. The 5 tactic switches which were next on the list were pretty easy to install and gave the board a somewhat more complete look. But I was still far off from being done. Next on the list were 18 little ceramic capacitors. Ceramic capacitors also don't have any polarity, so these too were easy to install. It only took me a little while to get all 18 of these soldered to the board, and to cut off all the excess leads. At this point I was pretty happy with how things were coming along. For the LED bulb, I had to make sure the positive lead went into the right direction again, which was also marked on the board and can be easily identified since the positive lead of the bulb is longer than the negative. The 2-pin header for power had to be installed with the open end facing outward of the board. And that was followed by the two transistors and regulators, which look very similar to one another, and I had to really make sure not to get them mixed up. The next step were two capacitor trimmers, which were new to me, but the main board had it clearly marked out in which way these go on there, making my life really easy. The power indicator, which also doesn't have any polarity, was one of the easiest pieces to install in this build. Then came 6 electrolytic capacitors, which have their positive ends marked the same way as the LED earlier, by having one lead longer than the other. The positive leads had to be soldered to the board where the markings were shown as a square box. There was also only one way to install the 3-pin power connector, which doesn't really need to be explained. The male and female pin headers were next on the list. They are pretty easy to separate since the male headers will have the little pins sticking up on both sides. Then followed 3 slide switches, which turned out to be quite tricky to get them fitted into the board right. Even the soldering part took some time since all the pins were so close together to one another. But once that was done, I could finally move on to the BNC connector, where I noticed right away that the pins were way thicker than all the other components in this set. That meant it would take longer to heat up the pins for the solder to properly stick to it. For the next step, the plan asked to create a test signal ring out of one of the cutoff leads that I had now laying around. This turned out to be quite tricky because it was pretty hard to try holding it in place while at the same time trying to solder it to the main board. After that, the plan asked me to shorten the spot marked as JP3. And I then decided to install the legs before moving to the LCD board for my final solder. There were a lot of pins to solder. And I mounted the LCD screen to the main board to make sure it fit well enough. And this is what the final results looked like. I then plugged in my finished oscilloscope to a power cord I had laying around at home to do a final test of the board and see if all the components were getting the needed power to run properly when I realized something.
The power cord that I've been using to run this little oscilloscope is only rated for 6 volts, but this oscilloscope is rated for 9 volts. So in order for me to test it right, I need a 9-volt power supply, which I do not have at home right now. So I thought to myself, I should next build a regulator where I can regulate the power that I'm giving to this oscilloscope, and then I can further test it and make sure it works properly. So I've ordered myself another DIY kit. So don't forget to hit that subscribe button down below and follow me to see how I'm building the new DIY kit. That includes the power regulator where I can adjust the voltage that I'm giving to my oscilloscope making it work, and in the next video I will show you how everything comes together. Thank you for following me, and stay tuned for the next video.